You're listening to a 3CR podcast of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia.
Radio MMT respectfully acknowledges the traditional custodians of the land from which we are broadcasting, the Wurundjeri people, and we are broadcasting to the Kulin Nations. Our focus is economics, that is, how stuff is produced and distributed. We recognise that for many tens of thousands of years, First Nations people's connection to country successfully embodied the world's oldest continuous economy, which was catastrophically disrupted by genocide and displacement. We acknowledge that we have much to learn to reshape our current extractive and exploitive system to achieve sustainable prosperity for everyone.
Radio MMT. Economics for the rest of us with Anne
and Kev.
Radio MMT.
Looking at the world through the lens of modern monetary theory.
Radio MMT. Macroeconomics for a well-being economy.
Macroeconomics? Isn't that incredibly boring?
No, Kevin, it's incredibly interesting. It's all about who gets what and why.
Who gets what and why? Okay, I'm in.
RadioMMT@gmail.com.
Incredibly interesting macroeconomics for the rest of us. Welcome to Radio MMT. How are you this week, Anne?
Hello, Kev. I'm feeling pretty sprightly today.
Sprightly. Excellent to hear it. Excellent to hear. I've been sluggish, so that's good. Between the two of us, we should be able to pull this one off.
That's right. And hello to our lovely listener. Thanks for joining us again as we poke our noses in where they're not wanted.
Some people want us to, and if they can't get any sense anywhere else in the world, hopefully they can get it here.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, I'm going to give a little plug for my mate's show. He does a show on Southern FM on a Wednesday evening between 10 p.m. and midnight. His name's Pete. He's an old housemate of mine. He's got an excellent music show. If you're after excellent music, give that one a listen.
How is the man in a van travelling since I saw him 2 weeks ago?
Okay, well, so sometimes you live in a van and you feel as if you're on the wrong side of accommodation. But, last weekend I went to the Golden Plains Music Festival.
Mm-hmm.
I've got two vans and I went in my project van, which I'm fixing up at the moment.
Okay, why did you take that one?
Because the big one's too big. And the last time I went to Golden Plains in my big one, it's got LPG, it's got power tools, it's got everything in it, all the things that they don't like. And so it's always a bit of a struggle.
Patting you down would be quite a process.
Yeah, and I tried to explain to them I live in it. And anyway, so this time I took the other one. And I was looked upon with great envy this time because everybody else is in their tents. Meanwhile, I'm in very flush accommodation. I even had an induction cooker and my coffee machine hanging out the back of the vans.
So did the barbarians try to invade?
No. They just look in an admiring and sometimes envious fashion. So a good week to be in the van this week.
Great to hear.
Yeah.
Well, today we are going to go back to basics. So Kev and I were chatting and we were thinking about what are we doing this show for and why do we call it Radio MMT, where the MMT stands for modern monetary theory. So we're going to go back to the fundamentals of modern monetary theory, which is a branch of heterodox economics that explains how the national economy works, and it does that by starting with monetary systems. So that's what this show is all about, the Radio MMT. It deals with monetary systems and it deals with the implications of that understanding for national policy and politics.
Yeah. So we've got to get back to basics every now and again and just explain some of the fundamentals of MMT. So
I like to go back to the basics for myself.
Yeah, it is.
To remind myself.
Refining the basics is a very handy exercise. Hey, but before we do that, can I just have a little analysis of Trump's tariffs? Okay.
Right.
So I've just been thinking about it. I was working this afternoon just thinking about it, and things aren't always obvious, and you always try and figure out what else is going on.
Right.
So Trump is introducing tariffs to...
So say what a tariff is.
So it's a tax. Trump is introducing a tax on imported steel and aluminium. Mm-hmm. And he's doing that so that Americans will favour the local product.
Makes the imported version more expensive.
Yes, and so this is like putting a tax on tobacco or alcohol. He's trying to change behaviour so that Americans will use the homegrown product, and his belief is that will stimulate the local industry and make America great again. Okay, that's his whole thing. He's trying to rebuild America to make it an industrial powerhouse. So he's bringing in these tariffs
because a lot of American industry went overseas, I guess, during the last few decades.
Deliberately, they offshored everything because it was cheaper. You know, So what this means is that some firms might be importing Chinese steel or aluminium because it's cheaper.
Right.
So the cheap stuff's no longer going to be available. They're going to have to pay for the US stuff, which I'm guessing is more expensive. So the price of steel and aluminium will go up. So if you're drinking a can of soft drink, if you're buying a toaster, if you're building a car, if you're building a building, so there'll be a price rise. But then you've got to think, is America geared to fill the void of the imported stuff? Do they have the productive capacity to replace the imports with the local product?
Do they have the factories and the assembly line and so on?
Well, probably not. So then the idea is that maybe firms will build steel making and aluminium production in America. Well, Trump's in for 4 years. Then we don't know what's happening after Trump. But what we do know is that uncertainty is at a record height. The uncertainty is running at twice the level that it was during COVID.
Oh, they can measure uncertainty, can they?
Yeah. So there's a lot of uncertainty. So if you're a firm and you're thinking, rightio, well, I'm going to build myself a steelmaking plant in the US, it's going to take you a couple of years, and then a couple of years after that, everything might change and you might just be wasting your money. So is the capacity void going to be filled? Probably not, which means you're still going to need to import stuff, which is going to be more expensive, 25% more expensive. So essentially, it's inflationary. And from an MMT perspective, we regard a tax as an extinguishment of
dollars.
Money going out from the government is spent into the economy. Money coming back in is that money extinguished. So the tariffs are an extinguishment of currency, which means you're shrinking the local economy. You're charging a tax on an imported product, and then that tax, being a tax, is extinguished. So you buy Chinese steel. It used to be $1. Now it's $1.25.
Right.
What happens to that $1.25? Well, the $1 goes to the Chinese like it normally would have. The 25 cents is a tax.
Right.
So the consumer pays that to the government as a tax.
Oh, okay.
So there's money taken out of the economy and extinguished via the government. So it's a contraction of the private sector. But what he's saying is he doesn't regard taxes as currency extinguished. He regards taxes as a form of government revenue. This is the orthodoxy. And so he's going to say, well, because we're getting these taxes in from the tariffs, we can give tax cuts to the rich.
Right.
So the result of that is that you'll have consumers paying more, the rich people getting a tax deduction, which means the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. Which is, as I said a couple of shows ago, we're just seeing inequality is going to rise under Trump because of the measures that he's bringing in. But the one good thing about this is that if there's less money in the economy and consumers are consuming less, we might see some degrowth. And from an environmental point of view, that's a good thing.
Yes, although unfortunately we're degrowing in the wrong part of the economy.
Well, but that's not so much like an opinion piece. That's an analysis. That's like money being extinguished, private sector's contracting. And the other thing is that all the people who are exporting to the US are going to do is look for different markets. And so the US will be isolated. So if you used to sell to the US, but they're not buying as much because they've put tariffs on, so your product isn't as attractive as it used to be, you're going to look elsewhere. You're going to sell in Europe, you're going to sell to the UK, you're going to sell to Russia, I don't know, you're going to sell to somebody, but not the US. And so the US then become isolated.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because it is part of standard economics that you do put tariffs on to protect local industries, but you have to do it when your industry is in a certain phase of its development, and you need to do it with a bit of forethought and planning.
So you wonder how much forethought Trump's putting into this. I was speaking to somebody who said that maybe he's just trying to just kick the shit out of the stock market, drive it down so that he can buy low and essentially insider trading.
Maybe with Trump, either way, he wins.
Yeah, I don't think he's that clever. I think what he's doing is having an adverse effect on the stock market, and being the opportunist that he is, he'll go, oh, look, the stocks have dropped, I might just jump in right now, So there you go, tariffs.
Thank you, Kevin. So in a moment, I'm going to put Kevin to the test. I'm going to ask Kevin a bunch of true-false questions just as a way of orienting us to the basics of modern monetary theory.
You're listening to 3CR 855 AM on digital and on the internet. www.3cr.org.au.
Okay, you've caught me I'm a bit vague this afternoon. so be kind, please.
We'll try and be kind to you. I've put you in the hot seat now, Kevin.
Okay.
Because you do claim to know a bit about modern monetary theory.
I don't claim anything. I just roll in here and just mouth off.
Too, well, folks, I'm going to be testing Kev's knowledge of Australia's monetary system.
Oh, no. This can only go badly, really, can't it?
All right, the clock starts now. The Australian federal government can never run out of Australian dollars. True or false?
Well, true.
The Australian federal government creates new dollars whenever it spends, and that's the only way it can spend dollars.
Well, yeah, it has to spend with the economy. True.
See if we can keep you to one word here, Kevin.
Like a courtroom, isn't it? Not that I've been in one before, but maybe I'm gearing up.
The Australian government does not tax us in order to get tax dollars in order to spend dollars.
True. If what you're saying is that the government doesn't need the tax dollars to spend. Okay, yeah, true.
The Australian federal government does not need to save dollars in order to spend dollars in the future.
True.
The Australian federal government does not need a budget surplus in order to spend dollars.
True. Can you give me one that's false?
There's a bit of a pattern here, isn't there? The Australian federal government does not borrow to raise revenue in order to spend dollars.
Well, that's true.
The Australian federal government does not issue bonds to raise revenue to spend dollars.
True. Same last question.
He just can't keep it to one word, can he?
No.
All right. The limit on how many dollars the Australian government can spend is the real resources. That is the stuff which is available to purchase with the dollars.
Well, that's true. I mean, all this is obvious. Give me something difficult.
All spending carries the risk of inflation, including spending by the federal government.
Well, true.
State governments, businesses and households do have financial constraints. In other words, they do need to earn money or borrow money or sell assets before they can spend.
True.
And the Australian government is not like a household or a business or a state government because it is the currency issuer. In other words, it has no financial constraints.
False. I mean, true.
Ooh, you nearly slipped up there. The Australian government's financial deficit is everybody else's financial surplus.
True.
The Australian government's financial debt is simply all the deficits added up over time.
True. It's an accounting thing. It's not a debt. Debt's probably the wrong word. Is that true? True.
True. And if you could understand why the answer for all of those questions was true, then you have a firm grip on MMT. So I'm pleased to say, Kevin, that you passed with flying colours.
I was looking for the trick question, but there wasn't one there. They're all just...
You've woken up a bit, though.
Yeah, true. That's true. True.
So the thing is, right, that all of this, which you and I consider as obvious as the nose on our faces, really, all of this goes against what you hear all the time in the media and in popular culture and academia and the politicians.
True.
You can stop now. The clock stopped.
Okay.
The Australian government, they're all saying that the Australian government is in danger of running out of dollars, and this is a big fat lie. But here's an example of someone telling that furphy, and this is Jerome Powell, who is the current chair of the US's central bank, which is called the Federal Reserve. And he said this on the US 60 Minutes show back in 2024. And Kevin, he's sounding strangely like a Monty Python skit.
Another economic hangover after the pandemic is a sharp increase in the national debt. 30 years from now, it is projected to be $144 trillion. Or $1 million per household.
Gentlemen, pray silence for the President of the Royal Society for putting things on top of other things.
Jerome Powell, the chair of the Federal Reserve.
I thank you, gentlemen. This year, our members have put more things on top of other things than ever before. But I should warn you, this is no time for complacency.
The U.S. federal government's on an unsustainable fiscal path, and that just means that the debt is growing faster than the economy.
there are still many things, and I cannot emphasize this too strongly, not on top of other things.
We're borrowing from future generations.
I myself, on my way here this evening, saw a thing that was not on top of another thing in any way. Shame indeed.
I have the sense this worries you very much.
It's time for us to get back to putting a priority on fiscal sustainability.
But we must not allow ourselves to become too despondent.
But is the national debt a danger to the economy?
In the long run, the U.S. federal government's on an unsustainable fiscal path.
If there was not one thing that was not on top of another thing, our society would be nothing more than a meaningless body of men that gathered together for no good purpose. This year, our Australasian members and the various organizations affiliated to our Australasian branches put no fewer than 22 things on top of other things.
RBA Deputy Governor Michelle Bullock says our unemployment rate will need to rise to 4.5%.
Well done, all of you. But there is one cloud on the horizon.
How do you assess the national debt?
In this last year, our Staffordshire branch has not succeeded in putting one thing on top of another. Therefore, I call upon our Staffordshire delegate to explain this weird behaviour.
Well, Mr. Chairman, it's just that most of the members in Staffordshire feel the whole thing's a bit silly.
I suppose it is a bit. What have we been doing wasting our lives with all this nonsense? Right, okay, meeting adjourned forever.
And that is the calibre of the public discussion about the national debt.
Ah, dearie me, yes. Now, in the second half of this show, we're going to discuss such things as the deficit myth and the barter myth and other things as we get back to basics.
Absolutely. But there was one thing in that skit, and this is actually a question for you as well. When they're talking about the national debt, they mentioned this number that the US national debt corresponds to $1 million per household. And what I thought, let me see if I've got this right, is that if the wealth of the United States was evenly distributed, as opposed to someone like Elon Musk having $400 billion.
Yeah.
So if we spread the wealth of the United States over every household, then every household would have $1 million worth of wealth. Am I reading that number in the right way?
Probably. It sounds right, because you're talking about the accumulated deficits over the decades that have resulted in $1 million per household having been transferred from the government to the private and overseas sector. So, yeah, essentially, yeah. But then if you gave an even spread of $1 million to every household in the United States, it would be a socialist country. Wouldn't that be terrible?
I did think they gave themselves away with that number.
Yeah, and we'll go into this further in the second half. But money spent by the government is transferred into the private sector for citizens to use. That's the ledger. Government deficit, private sector surplus. And we sort of talk about the private sector. It's the private sector and the overseas sector, which is the non-government sector, which is the sector which doesn't create the currency but receives the currency. I kind of call the overseas sector and the private sector just the private sector, because it sort of is.
That's good shorthand.
Yeah, some of it's local and some of it's overseas, but they're all receiving currency from the government. So just in terms of definition, the definition nuts out there. Shall we have a bit of a breather?
Sure.
I'm going to play a song from Skeleton, who I saw at the Golden Plains Music Festival. Saw a lot of good music at the festival. Didn't know a lot of bands. Was introduced to a lot of new bands. This is one of them. It's a band called Skeleton with a song called Let It Grow. There you go. That was Skeleton with their song "Let It Grow." They were really good.
Very mellow.
Yeah, just and they're standing in the open breeze, just swaying from side to side. It's nice. Where are we, Anne? We're going to talk about...
What are we going to do?
Well, we're going to go back to basics for MMT, and this means starting at the beginning. And the beginning is the current misconceptions. And one of the biggest misconceptions has to do with the origins of money. It's this concept that money is an invention or an instrument of the private sector that came from the barter system, that an economy arose from the barter system.
In other words, we were bartering before we had money.
Yeah, so barter is the act of exchanging like for like, and it's always existed. People barter all the time. But the neoclassical orthodox understanding is that money evolved from this system of exchange.
Can I just add that there has never been an entire society that runs its entire economy on barter?
Can I just read my next point, which is, however, there is no evidence that any economy evolved from barter ever.
We should have practiced this one.
No, it's better live. Okay, so we understand that there's barter, but for barter to exist, it's much easier if you have a value attached to the things that you're exchanging. And to have a value attached to the things that you're exchanging is much easier when you have a monetary system. So it's far more likely that barter evolved after money was introduced, because then you could put a value on things and say, I'm going to give you this bag of oranges for that carton of eggs because they're both worth $5, and therefore we can figure out how to swap them. The presumption from the orthodoxy is that that's why they invented money. But money seems to have always been an instrument of government. So government introduces money, and then barter kind of evolves from that starting point.
One possibility within a monetary system.
Yeah. So the system of money now is controlled by government. The money is produced by the Reserve Bank of Australia, which is an instrument of government, not the private sector. And if the private sector ever tried to create its own money, it doesn't work, because you need government regulation around your money for it to be stable.
Got a question for you.
Yeah.
Just keep note of where you are in your notes there.
Yeah.
So you're saying that the private sector can't create money, but then there's this other saying where anyone can create money. It's just a matter of getting it accepted. So the private sector can't create currency, but there have been situations, haven't there, like the American colonies, where like the general store and certain banks and certain cities even would create what they call bills. And that was a really confusing system, because it was effectively like you had 20 currencies within every county, and people had to figure out what the exchange rates were for them all.
What you said before was that anybody can create money. The problem is getting it accepted. The second clause, but getting it accepted is the important thing.
Right.
And getting money to be accepted.
Universally accepted, yeah.
Only seems to happen when governments take control of it. They have to do all the things that governments need to do to make sure that the currency is stable.
Particularly the fact that they tax in the dollar.
Yeah, talk me through that one.
So anyone can create money because anyone can create an IOU. And money is simply an IOU that's transferred between two other parties.
It's a promissory note.
Yeah. And so what is it that makes the Australian dollar universally accepted is the fact that the Australian federal government also taxes in the dollar, and that drives the need for the dollar throughout the economy. Even if you're not getting taxed, Kevin, or I'm not getting taxed, somebody out there in the economy is getting taxed, and they'll want the dollars. And therefore, it sort of runs through the whole economy that everyone wants the dollars, and they're willing to do 8 hours work for a few bits of paper or a few digits in their bank account.
Yeah, because they need to pay tax in Australian dollars. It enforces the currency. So we then understand that money is an instrument of government to provision itself, and it's not an instrument of the private sector. And the neoclassical, the neoliberal ideology that we follow at the moment is very focused on the private sector, and it has this mistaken belief that money is created by the private sector and it needs to be given to the government so that it can afford to spend. So that's the barter myth.
And by the way, the barter myth still appears in textbooks. When you go to university to learn economics, what do you get in the first chapter of your textbook? You get the barter myth. And so they're imagining that there was some kind of market where the person with the oranges and the person with the eggs was trying to figure out how many eggs do I swap for all these oranges, as if these markets even existed, with everyone standing around trying to figure out how many chickens to how many fish. As if that ever even existed. And then somebody goes, hey, let's invent money. But that's the story that appears in the textbooks.
Hey, one of the people at my campsite at Golden Plains was a lovely fellow called Jake.
Mm-hmm.
And we started having this discussion.
Oh, did you?
And he brought up the barter myth. And I said, Jake, we're going to be at Golden Plains in a year and we're going to go to Meredith before that. I've got some homework for you. You've got a year to produce some factual evidence that any economy ever started from barter.
Brilliant.
And you might want to read a book by a fellow called Graeber called 5,000 Years of Debt, because that might just make you give up. And for this, that's a really good reference, is that book by Graeber.
Yeah, it is a bit of a read. And you can also find some shorter articles, especially by someone called Randall Ray, W-R-A-Y.
Yeah. So do we have anything more to add to the origins of money? Or
just that if you talk to an anthropologist, they might agree with us.
Yeah. There's plenty of evidence for government-controlled or authority-controlled currency.
Usually money arose when big states or big empires arose, and they did that to provision their soldiers, I think was one of the reasons.
Yeah.
So they would tax the peasants a few gold coins or whatever, but they would send the soldiers out there to buy their horses and whatever else they needed from the peasants, and they would give them a few coins, and then the tax collector would come along the next year and take the coins back.
Yeah, currency is essentially an instrument of government to provision itself. And when a government produces more currency than is required to provision itself, there's then room for private markets to exist. Now, this point about the excess money that is introduced into an economy by government being the foundation of private markets, this is fundamentally at odds with the neoclassical understanding.
Fundamentally. We are at odds with most of the received wisdom out there, Kevin.
Yeah, they say that it's private markets that generate all of the economy, and that the government is an appendage or some sort of a
obstacle.
Yeah, when it's completely the other way around. And we've said this before, if the private market fails, like it did in COVID, the economy can still exist because the government is there.
We saw it happen.
Yeah, this is in our lived experience. We saw the government step in and prop up the economy when the private sector ground to a halt during COVID. Can you imagine what would happen if the government ground to a halt and it stopped? We see this in the US where they have the debt ceiling, and they play this game every year. If the government stops paying out, the economy grinds to a halt. If the private sector stops, the economy doesn't grind to a halt. That should tell you something fundamental.
That's why Jerome Powell really annoyed me when he said we've got to pay down this debt that occurred during COVID. I mean, here he is, the chair of the Federal Reserve. I'm sure he understands that he's just typing on his keyboard to create the dollars.
Yeah, they play this game. It's an interesting thing. You're with Anne and Kev on Radio MMT.
At 3CR Community Radio in Melbourne, Australia.
And wherever you get your podcasts.
Economics for the rest of us.
So this then brings us to the deficit myth.
The deficit.
We've addressed the barter myth, which is the origins of money. Now we go to the deficit myth. And the deficit myth is that a government is constrained in its spending by the tax that it receives from its citizens, that it can't spend more than it receives in tax, even though we have decades and decades of governments running continuous deficits and the sky doesn't fall in.
The deficit myth also says that if the government continues to be in deficit over the long term, that'll mount up into this huge debt that our children and grandchildren will be paying off, and in fact it will ruin the economy.
Yeah.
And they put these things like debt clocks, up on the wall and stuff.
Now when you're born into this, as you and I were, it just seems like that's how it is because that's what you're told. And then you run into some people that explain it to you differently and you go, oh, okay, so if the government is spending into the economy, it goes from the government sector into the private sector. Government deficit equals private sector surplus. These are the two sides of the ledger.
Just an accounting term, and unfortunately I think the politicians use the word deficit because it does sound like a lack or a negative or something bad. So they sort of twist it and distort what that is to make it sound like the government's doing the wrong thing when it's simply doing what it needs to do.
I can kind of live with the term deficit because it's an accounting term. I have struggled with debt. So when they talk about government debt, they're talking about accumulated government deficits over the years. You know, one deficit this year, one deficit the next year, it all adds up to the government debt. Mm-hmm. Debt is a word that sounds like something needs to be paid back. And quite simply, we can test that. We can see what happens if we pay it back. So government spends into the economy, it ends up in the private sector. The private sector accumulates savings, and if the government debt was to be paid back, all that needs to happen is all of those savings need to be returned to the government. Okay, and then the books would be balanced, and there'd be no government debt, but you'd have no savings in the private sector. You'd wipe out the private sector economy. Yet that's what the neoclassical economists are urging us. That's what the politicians are saying that we need to do. We need to balance the books. I don't understand why they don't understand. It's a weird thing. World War II, governments spent and spent and spent. All the able-bodied males were employed as soldiers. All the able-bodied, everybody else was employed in industry. All the resources were used, and it cost heaps. You know?
The real argument should not be whether the government should be spending or whether the government should be in deficit or whether the government should have a debt. The argument should really be what are they spending it on?
And who's getting it? And because government spending into the economy is central to the economy's ability to function, how that money is spent and distributed is crucial. Public money should advance the public good. So if you're sending your money to a bunch of fossil fuel companies and advancing gas exploration and mining, and all this money ends up with a very few players who are extremely rich producing pollution, that's not good. But that's what we're doing. And we're saying, we have to keep doing that because that's good for the economy. Whose economy? It's good for the players who now fund both main political parties in their election campaigns.
Right.
The government spends into the economy and it allows this accumulation of wealth in certain industries or with certain people. It distorts the democratic process and you end up being captured by it. So this is what's happened, and it's happened incrementally.
So I guess also we want to distinguish between what modern monetary theory says and what you can do with monetary theory when you're applying it to the current situation. So that's you applying what you understand of how money works to see what's happening politically.
This is where the teals interest me. Here we see public money distorting the democratic process, and we see a reaction to that through the teals, who are nowhere near as left as they should be. But the fact that they're prepared to take on the majors is
That's
good.
Kevin again segueing out of MMT basics. Now, was there any?
No, this is MMT in the real world. We're seeing money being created by the government, injected into the economy. We're seeing it being hoarded by special interest groups to the detriment of other people, and a reaction to that is the teals saying, "Hey, hang on, what you're doing there is undemocratic. Please shut me up. I can talk forever."
I'm James Juniper. I'm an economist at the University of Newcastle, and you're listening to Radio 3CR.
Just the process, just to make it a little bit more concrete, for how does money get created in this day and age?
Yep.
And this is sort of similar for Australia and the USA, but also slightly different because we have different institutions. But in Australia, I have to admit, I don't know all the nitty-gritties of the process, but in Australia, it starts with Parliament making a spending decision. So a spending decision could be something like, we are going to pay anyone over a certain age, we're going to pay them the aged pension. So that's a spending decision.
I'm looking forward to that.
And of course, it can be parliaments from many years before. Parliament will then pass an appropriations bill. So that's just saying we're probably going to spend this much money this year.
Hey, just on that, I always get confused with the appropriation. Is it one appropriations bill? Is that like the...
It's one big thing that matches the budget, I think.
Right. Okay, yeah, good. I always thought that appropriation bills were every time they come up with an idea, that's how you...
No. So this is where I get a bit confused about the process, but I think if there's extra money that they're wanting to spend, they have to tack on another
They have to adjust their appropriations bill. So the appropriations bill is the annual budget spend, essentially.
Yeah, basically. It's sort of saying, yes, we can spend the money. So then this turns into instructions that get passed on to the Treasury, which is another department in the government. And then the Treasury passes on these instructions to the central bank, which is the RBA, or the Reserve Bank of Australia. And it is saying to the RBA, you need to type numbers into the accounts of the commercial banks. Commercial banks are like the Commonwealth Bank or Westpac, the Big Four and all the other banks. And so the central bank is saying to the commercial banks, we're going to give you these big chunks of money, and then you have to divvy it up into the proper accounts. So find all your pensioners who've got accounts with you and type in. So if you're a pensioner and you see your account increase by, say, $1,000, that is new money that the government has created by all these people typing numbers into the proper places.
With a computer.
With a computer.
They didn't go and have to borrow anything from anywhere. They didn't go and collect money from taxes.
They didn't look down the back of the couch.
They just went to Treasury, who then instructed...
The central bank.
All you need is a computer. Yep.
That's right. And so this is why modern monetary theory says that the creation of money is a legally codified accounting system. Okay, so all this has got very strict laws around it, which is why you...
Government regulation. This is what we're talking about. If this was just some private person doing it, it could be chaos. You know, we were talking about DOGE the other day and how you got these young IT guys who are going into the government payment system of the US.
This is what they're about to disturb very badly.
So you've got the US payment system, which is responsible for, I think it's about $7 trillion worth of payments into the US economy every year. And Musk has sent two of his young guys and they're mucking around with the source code of this payment system.
Right.
Okay, this is what we're talking about when we say you need government regulation. Because you let these cowboys get control of it, anything can happen.
But every now and then, Kevin, the central bankers do let the truth of what they're doing slip out. So you don't have to take it from me and Kev that it's the central bankers using their computers to create money. They're going to tell you themselves.
It's not tax money.
There's nothing to prevent the federal government from creating as much money as it wants and paying it to somebody.
We simply use the computer to mark up the size of the account.
We can create money electronically, and that's what we do these days. It's a heavy responsibility to be able to just create money like that.
Who did we just hear from?
So we just heard Ben Bernanke, who was the chair of the Federal Reserve from 2006 to 2014, and he was speaking during an interview on US 60 Minutes in 2009. We also heard Alan Greenspan, chair of the Federal Reserve from 1987 to 2006, and he was speaking to a committee on the budget at the US House of Representatives. And, of course, there was our favourite friend there, Phil Lowe. So sad. He's no longer the governor of the Reserve Bank of Australia. And he was speaking to the National Press Club in 2021. And all of them are basically saying that the federal government, via its central bank, which I think of as really just a mechanism, creates the dollars by typing on computers.
No taxes, no loans, no bonds, just type it away. Type away, type.
You know, you were mentioning DOGE there. It's like that's why it's so important to understand that money is not a physical thing that we can run out of like oil or water or gold. Think of money as an institutionalized system, as a legally codified accounting system, because I think this is the only argument that can counter what we can call, I think we can call it the DOGE mentality now, which is this mentality that the government needs to get out of debt and that it needs to save money by slashing all the services that we all need. So this is what the deficit myth is. And so this mentality, this DOGE mentality, is the logical outcome of decades of false economics supporting this ideology known as neoliberalism, which came to us as trickle-down economics. It came to us as economic rationalism. We had the Washington Consensus. We had third-way politics, and they all looked like this austerity. And now we have DOGE, who are austerity on steroids.
It's terrible. We've got to go. So I hope you've understood the barter myth, the deficit myth, and how money is created. We'll see you in a couple of weeks. Bye.
See you then, Kevin. You've been listening to Radio MMT with Anne and Kev.
We'd love your feedback. Email us on radiommt@gmail.com or search Radio MMT on social media.
Listen to this show anytime wherever you get your podcasts or on 3cr.org.au/Radio MMT.
Support this show and the station by subscribing to 3cr.org.au and mention Radio MMT.
We thank all our guests.
And we thank economist Professor Bill Mitchell and his MMTEd.org, educating the masses on modern monetary theory.
And thank you to our listeners for listening. And I thank you, Kevin.
And I thank you, Anne. So what's planned for next week?
Kevin, there is still so much to talk about. We've got to expose all this rotten economics.
Well, no, that's good, and I get it. Do you reckon we could use a bit more music?
Well, I made a list of all these terrible economic theories. Like, I've heard of the theory of comparative advantage, or the quantity theory of money, or the loanable funds theory.
Have you heard of a band called Single Gum Theory? Like, they're a really good band. I'm sure there's a whole range of, like, macroeconomic music that I could bring into the show.
Yeah, but we really need to do marginal productivity theory, not to mention the natural rate of unemployment and the money multiplier.
You've got a pretty good singing voice. I play bass. Bill, he plays guitar. I reckon we could form a macroeconomics band. Like, we could deliver this whole message by music.
Well, we could call the band the permanent income hypothesis, or the Ricardian equivalence, or rational expectations.
I think we're onto something here. We're trying to make macroeconomics more interesting to the masses. We're going to form this band and sing it to them. And we're going to bring the economists in. We're going to get music.
You've been listening to a 3CR podcast produced in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.